Hey, my name's Matt, and this is how I did a full game audio treatment on this stunning map I downloaded from Unreal Marketplace, using Unreal Engine 5, Wise, and Ableton 11. There are tons of cool little details to cover, but if you press for time, I've included some handy bookmarks below if you'd like to skip to a certain part. Out the gate, I wanted to find a virtual environment that I could use as a creative playground for my sound design, composition, and more technical integration skills. The most important thing to me is building a palpable sonic atmosphere that's both immersive and aesthetically consistent. Exploring the Unreal Marketplace, I discovered the Sicka mansion map, and it seemed like a perfect fit. I'm a massive fan of the horror genre, so this was right up my alley. All credit goes to Sicka, who I've linked down below for creating such a beautiful map. Opening the map in Unreal, I could begin plotting out my course of action. This map includes 7 fully furnished rooms, complete with beautiful lighting, a first-person character with a flashlight, and a few simple systems, like the ability to pick up items. I set to work creating a spreadsheet of everything I wanted to achieve. This spreadsheet would continue to be reviewed, revised, and updated as the project went on. I began by determining my main audio groups: ambience, player sounds, emitters, notifications, dialogue, and music. Then I spent time exhausting every audio cue possible. During the planning stage, I also determined a color code system and a file naming system, which would keep things from getting too messy. I even came up with a rough storyline. Our unnamed protagonist is a young priest sent to the mansion after Father James disappeared there a week ago. I made some quick tweaks to the map to better suit my project. It was way too well lit, so I got rid of most of the lighting. Then I added some trees outside so it didn't feel like we were floating in space. I added a system in which doors could be unlocked through a short animation by collecting the right key, and I added some on-screen titles to notify the player of their progress. There's the key. Now that our template was in place, I could begin building our soundscape from the ground up. Creating ambience came first, so that we could have an atmospheric bed for the rest of our sounds to lay on during the creation process. I used the Audiokinetic spatial audio rooms and portals to create designated ambient zones for all 7 rooms, which could allow us to have distinct ambience for different areas. Using the 7 zones, I could then attach subtle room tones to each room. These zones were also handy for attaching corresponding reverb buses, allowing sounds to resonate differently depending on the player's location. Soft, roomy reverbs were for the smaller rooms and halls, and big, cavernous reverbs for the big rooms. The portals allow us to seamlessly transition from one room to the next. Next up, we can start bringing the space to life with some emitters. These are looping audio vents that can be put in specific locations for the player to hear as they pass by. This could be anything from the dramatic thunderstorm that grows in clarity as our player approaches a window, to the light crackling of the fireplace, the creaking sound of the house settling, a rodent skittering just out of sight, that suit of armor you pass making some odd breathing noises, the ticking of a grandfather clock, or even some ominous whispering as you near some paintings. Placing these sounds is often just a matter of setting an attenuation zone that dictates the volume of the sound in relation to the location of the player. It can also be used creatively. In one spot, I used attenuation to make the ominous sound of a rocking chair completely stop whenever the player enters the room. Who the hell was rocking in that chair? An element of chance can also be important. Some emitters utilize a more complex hierarchy of sound. Take our thunderstorm, for example. While the rain is a constant loop, we need the thunder to have the same spontaneity of real life. Using a sequence container, we can trigger a random thunder strike, which is punctuated by a random amount of silence, between 15 and 40 seconds, giving our weather a very natural cadence. Now that our game space is a living space with drama and intrigue, we can start to put our player character into that space. The first and most obvious thing was to give the player some footsteps. After crafting some distinct footstep samples for each different floor material, wood, thin carpet, and a thick carpet, I put them in groups where they could be called upon in a random order, giving them a very natural feel. I had to create a basic blueprint in Unreal that sent out a line that could determine what floor material the player was walking on, and then switch it to that corresponding footstep group. But that in itself wasn't cool enough, so I added a creak system. This is just a random collection of floorboard creaks and groans that can randomly trigger every dozen footsteps or so. This gave an element of realism to how it feels walking around an old house, and is one of my favorite little details. It was also important to create a flashlight system that wasn't just serviceable but satisfying. It's hard to show in the video, but I tweaked the blueprint so that every press of the F button triggered a button click, and every release triggered the button release. The actual sound used is simple, but its implementation is what made it addicting. At this point, the reverb zones we set up earlier really came in handy. By enabling the game-defined aux sends on our player sounds, our footsteps and flashlight sounds can be put in the space, resonating uniquely within each room. These aux sends are used on all the player sounds and emitters, and are kind of like the glue that puts it all together. Now that we've created a realistic player presence in our atmospheric soundscape, we need some game-oriented sound design, stuff to let the player know they've triggered, accomplished, or failed something. A lot of these sounds will be triggered by the key and door system we created at the beginning. We'll have to design these sounds for maximum satisfaction, which will keep players feeling rewarded and coming back for more. In Ableton, my DAW of choice, I often opt for a combination of synths and samples. For the key pickup, we have a reversed and modified key sound, followed by a resonating synth. For the door locked sound, we have some doorknob wiggling and a dissonant choir one-shot. The door unlock sound was one of my favorites to make, combining a sequence of an unlocking sound, a dissonant string stinger, and a reverberating creak. There's also really simple stuff like the zoom or item inspect sounds. Sometimes, we need to create some more complex moments to drive our story forward. Here's some stuff you'll hear when you walk up to a locked door on the upper level. A big moment I wanted to include as our player approaches the final room is a hall full of Lovecraft-style doorways that just lead into an abyss of swirling madness. Now, since I don't have the means to create that visually, I opted to represent that sonically. For the first room, I manipulated some vocal recordings and screaming sounds, laying them over a recording that I stretched out into an eerie drone. The next door features a manipulated prayer that I used some different techniques like grain delay to manipulate. The third door makes use of some haunting public domain 1920s ballroom music, inspired by The Caretaker. Finally, I used the last door as an excuse to go harsh noise mode on some electronic field recordings. These vignettes require as much sound design as they do composing, making them a fun detour in the sound design process. Our audio events can be placed just like the emitters from earlier, but they can also be placed using trigger boxes. This means the audio event will only play when the player passes through a specific area. Here's an example. When the player reaches this door, they suddenly hear some books topple behind them. This was because they entered the trigger box that plays that corresponding sound. I used the same process to integrate most of the dialogue. Whenever the player reaches certain areas or landmarks, it will trigger the corresponding dialogue. And yeah, that's my voice. This can open that door. The final touch of artistry in our soundscape is some dramatic music. I wrote about 9 little tunes corresponding to different rooms and the player's emotional state. The way we cycle through these is a combination of Wise's state system and Unreal's trigger boxes. We just need to create different states for each room, along with states for the player's emotional state, those being exploration, tension, and terror. I've attached the room state to identify whichever room zone the player is currently in. The emotional states are changed whenever a significant audio event is triggered. For example, when the books topple, we can also set the state to tension, changing the music. Here are some of the cues in their corresponding areas. Hello? Is there someone there? States can also affect other elements of the story. For instance, I've set it so that tension and terror states actually increase the volume of the thunder, adding some intense sub-frequencies to match the player's emotional state. Now that all that hard stuff is done, we can do some mixing. But not so fast. Mixing can actually make or break your game audio immersion. what we have to do is establish a hierarchy of importance. So for our game, we want dialogue to always be audible. We want non-diegetic sounds, like our interaction notifiers, to be higher up in the mix and present. Just below the dialogue and interactions, we have player sounds and nearby emitters, which are very important to the player's immediate immersion. At the bottom of the list, we have our ambience, distant emitters, and music. These are still important, but their omnipresence calls for less importance in being immediately distinguishable at all times. Then, we just gotta mix accordingly. Using Wise's Soundcaster, we can quickly compare and layer sounds to see what's working and what's a little too overpowering. We can also group our layers of sounds together to establish that hierarchy we were talking about earlier. One handy technique I used is ducking. So we want the dialogue and interaction sounds to be clear and distinct, but we can't sacrifice making our other groupings too quiet. So what we can do is apply ducking. Tweaking a few settings, we can duck our ambience and music every time our player pipes up. While subtle, it allows for a more dynamic mix that can highlight everything at the right times. And there we have it, a fully realized haunted house map in Unreal Engine. I hope you found this video informative. It was an incredibly fun project and I can't wait to take what I learned with me to my next project. Keeping it real in Unreal, this has been Matt, and thanks for watching.